Static. Then a pause. Not the kind radios usually have a real one. A human one. Say your name again, the voice said. Slower this time. I gave it to him. Full name, call sign, the whole thing, because at 9,000 feet with no airspeed indicator and a windshield the color of dishwater, you don't have the energy to wonder why a stranger on 122.9 wants your paperwork. He didn't answer for 4 seconds. I counted them. 4 seconds is a long time when your left engine is deciding whether it wants to keep spinning. Copy, he said. Then nothing. Just fly heading 280. Lose 300 feet a minute, trust me. Trust you, I repeated, and it came out flatter than I meant it to. Behind me, Reyes was gripping the center console so hard her knuckles had gone the color of the ash outside. You're a voice on an emergency frequency in the middle of nowhere. You understand I have 10 people on this airplane. I understand exactly what you have, he said. Something in that answer didn't sit right. Not wrong. Just time specific, like he'd said it before, to someone else. A long time ago. 2 minutes to the lake, he added. After that I can't help you. Ice doesn't wait. Behind me, one of the wounded Corporal Ibarra, the one who hadn't said a coherent word in 6 hours, started whistling. That same 4 notes he always whistled, over and over, like his body remembered a song his brain had let go of. Iverson, our flight nurse, put a hand flat on his chest without looking away from the altimeter that wasn't telling us anything anymore. 90 seconds, the voice said. Copy 90 seconds. My voice cracked on the number, just slightly, just enough that I heard it and hated it. You still with me, Compass? Nobody outside this cockpit had called me that in years. Not my instructors, not my squadron, nobody who wasn't already dead. I opened my mouth to ask how a stranger on an open frequency knew a call sign I hadn't used since flight school, and that's when the number 3 engine, our last one, coughed once, twice, and went silent. Losing 3! Reyes shouted it this time, no repeat, no discipline left in it at all, just a raw sound with words attached. Captain, we have 0 engines. 0. We have times 0 engines. I have it, I said, and I don't know where the words came from, because I did not, in that second, have it. Nobody has it, gliding 38 tons of dead metal toward ice they can't see, guided by a man whose voice sounded, more with every sentence, like something climbing up out of a grave I'd spent 6 years standing on top of, pressing the dirt down flat. Compass. Doyle's voice again. Close. Almost gentle. Which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. You're doing exactly what he'd have done. Nose down. Hold your attitude. I've got you. Whose time's he? I said, not a question. A demand. Torn out of me sideways while my hands did the only thing they had left to do, which was fly. Doyle didn't answer that. Not yet. What he said instead was, tree line's coming up on your left in 10 seconds. When you see it, you're mine and Compass. Whatever happens in the next 90 seconds, I need you to keep flying the airplane and not the conversation. We'll finish the conversation on the ground. For a half second nobody spoke. Then Reyes, very quietly, said the thing you're never supposed to say out loud in a cockpit. We're not going to make it. We are, I said. I don't know if I believed it. I know I said it like I did, because that's the only thing a captain is allowed to say at a moment like that. 60 seconds, the voice said. Look for the tree line. When you see the tree line, you're mine. I didn't know yet what he'd meant. 20 minutes earlier, when he'd asked if I had a middle name he should know. I didn't have room to ask. I had 10 people behind me who couldn't walk off this airplane on their own. 1 dead engine on the left, 1 dead engine on the right, 1 just now dying in the middle, and a frozen lake I couldn't see, guided by a man I'd never met, in a voice that sounded I would only let myself notice this later, much later, after all of it was over, almost exactly like my father's. But to understand why a stranger went quiet like that when I told him my name, I have to take you back. Not to the ash. Before the ash, 24 hours, and a lifetime, before any of us knew what was coming. The coffee in the thermos by my seat had gone cold 4 hours ago and I was still drinking it, because at 0300 on a Medevac run out of Elmendorf, cold coffee is still coffee, and coffee is still the only thing standing between you and a mistake. My name is Captain Dana Marsh. On the radio, for reasons that will make sense later, I go by Compass. I flew a C-17 Globemaster for 11 years before that night, and in all 11 of them, I had never once taken a compass off a shelf and thought about my father while I did it. That's a lie. I thought about him constantly. I just didn't let anyone see it happen. The airplane that night, tail number, call sign Reach 41, carried a crew of 4 and 6 patients being moved from a forward clinic near Bethel to the burn unit in Anchorage. One, Corporal Ibarra, was bad enough that Iverson, our flight nurse, hadn't left his side since Wheels Up. He had a habit, when the sedation was heavy, of whistling always the same 4 notes, some fragment of a song none of us recognized. Iverson had started filming it on her phone, a few seconds at a time. Not for fun, she told me once, when I raised an eyebrow. If the whistling stops, I want to know exactly when. That's the kind of crew we were. People who paid attention to small, ugly, useful things, because the big things were mostly out of our hands. Our loadmaster, Staff Sergeant Adier, had a habit of narrating the weather to himself in a low mutter whenever we crossed open water, not out of superstition. He'd tell you, but because the ocean doesn't care if you're watching it, so somebody should. At 0230 that morning, an hour and change before any of this started, I'd heard him say, to nobody, calm tonight. Too calm. And I'd filed it away the way you file away every small, meaningless thing a crew says in the dead hours of a long flight. Which is to say, I hadn't thought about it again until much later, when it stopped sounding meaningless at all. My co-pilot that night was First Lieutenant Dana Reyes, different Dana. We joked about it exactly once and never again, because there was nothing funny left to say about it by the time this story ends. Reyes was 18 months out of flight school, sharp, twitchy in the particular way that new pilots are twitchy, like she was still waiting for someone to tell her she wasn't allowed to be here yet. She had a habit of repeating altitude callouts twice. I used to find it annoying. I would come to be grateful for it in a way I can't fully explain. Somewhere around 0310, between checking on patients, Iverson had come forward and dropped into the jump seat behind me for her mandatory 10 minutes of rest, and we'd talked, the way crews talk in the dead middle of a long night flight, about nothing in particular. She asked about the whistling. He does it every time the sedation gets heavy, she said. Started on the second leg out of Bethel, same 4 notes, over and over. I asked the medic who prepped him if it means anything, family song, something like that. Nobody knows. He can't tell us right now, so I just record it. If it stops, I want to know exactly when, because with a head injury like his, a change in that kind of unconscious behavior can mean something's shifting that the monitors haven't caught yet. That's not in any training manual, I said. No, she agreed. It's just paying attention. Most of what actually saves people isn't in the manual. It's just somebody caring enough to notice the small thing before it becomes the big thing. She said it lightly, like it was nothing, and went back to the cargo bay a minute later. And I did not think, in that moment, that I would remember those words for the rest of my life. I do now. In my flight suit, left breast pocket, was a compass. Not a modern one, a brass hand-bearing compass. The kind bush pilots carried before GPS made, carrying one feel like carrying a relic. It had been my father's. It had ridden in that pocket, unused, ignored, resented a little if I'm honest, for 6 years. I didn't wear it because I believed in it. I wore it because taking it out felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, and leaving it in felt safer than either. My father was a bush pilot. Small planes, small strips, mail runs and hunters, and the occasional emergency evacuation out of villages no commercial carrier would touch, all across southern Alaska. He flew the way people flew before flying became a science by feel, by memory of terrain, by a stubborn conviction that if you paid close enough attention, the sky would tell you what it was about to do. I grew up in the right seat of a plane half the size of the one I fly now, watching him read a mountain range, the way other men read a newspaper, quick and certain, and never once looking down at a gauge to confirm what his eyes had already told him. He went missing on a supply run into the Chugach Range when I was 19. Weather moved in faster than the forecast promised. He never called it in. As an emergency, the last transmission anyone has on record from him is entirely routine, a position report, nothing more, which is its own particular kind of cruelty, because it means whatever happened too fast for him to even reach for the radio a second time. They searched for 6 weeks. I remember every one of them in a way I don't remember most years of my life. The specific sound of a phone ringing at an hour that meant nothing good. My mother standing in the kitchen with her hand pressed flat against the counter like she was holding the house up herself. They found the wreckage on week 5. No survivors. Weather inconclusive. Cause of loss inconclusive. A report that answered nothing and closed the file anyway, 4 months later, on a Tuesday, in an envelope that arrived while I was at school. I joined the Air Force 4 months after that. People assumed it was to honor him. It wasn't. It was the opposite. I wanted every switch labeled, every system backed up twice, every decision made by a committee of instruments, instead of a man's gut and a compass in his pocket. I wanted the version of flying that doesn't disappear into a mountain range and never come home. I remember telling my mother, the week I shipped out, that I was done trusting anything that couldn't be checked twice. She didn't argue with me. She just looked at me the way you look at someone who's about to learn something the hard way, and let me go. For 6 years it worked. The Air Force gave me exactly what I asked for. Procedure, redundancy, checklists thick enough to stop a bullet. I told myself that was better. I still believe, mostly, that it is. But somewhere in those 6 years, without ever quite deciding to, I stopped calling the small strip where my father used to keep his plane. I stopped answering when old friends of his reached out around the anniversary. I let an entire language, the language of bush flying, a feel and terrain and a compass instead of a screen, go quiet inside me. The way you let a language go quiet when you move somewhere it isn't spoken anymore. I told myself I hadn't lost it. I had simply chosen not to need it. I did not know, at 0300 that morning, drinking cold coffee over the Gulf of Alaska, how wrong that particular piece of self-deception was about to turn out to be. I did not know, at 0300 that morning, drinking cold coffee over the Gulf of Alaska, that within 4 hours every one of those redundancies would fail, one by one, in an order almost too neat to be an accident, and that the only thing standing between 10 people and the water below us would be exactly the kind of flying I had spent my whole adult life trying not to need. At 0347, the cockpit smelled, faintly, like a struck match. "You smell that?" Reyes said. I did. Sulfur thin, sharp, the kind of smell that doesn't belong at 34,000 feet, where there's nothing outside the airplane to burn. "Check the panel," I said, already knowing the panel wouldn't have an answer yet. It didn't. Every gauge sat exactly where it should. The engines ran smooth. The autopilot held its line like nothing in the world was wrong. But the smell got stronger, and behind us, through the tiny window over Ibarra's litter, the stars had started to disappear. Not behind cloud, which has an edge, a shape, something you can name. This had no edge. It was more like the sky itself had gone slightly, wrongly, dark. "Anchorage Center, reach 4-1, I said. "We're getting a sulfur smell in the cockpit, no fault indications." "Requesting information, any reports of volcanic activity in our area?" "Captain." Okafor's voice came up over the intercom from the cargo bay, tighter than his usual mutter. "You seeing this back here? It's like fog, except it's not moving like fog. It's just sitting on the wing." I hadn't seen it yet from the cockpit. I leaned toward the side window, and there it was, a thin gray film clinging to the leading edge of the wing, not blowing past the way ice or moisture would, just sitting, accumulating, the way dust settles on a shelf nobody's dusted in months. There was a pause on the line longer than I liked. "Reach 4-1, Anchorage Center, stand by." Whatever they came back with, I already knew, in the part of my chest that had been braced for something like this since I was 19 years old, that it would not be good news. "Reach 4-1, Anchorage Center. Be advised, we have a report of eruptive activity from Mount Griggs, initial VONA issued 11 minutes ago. Ash cloud extent currently unconfirmed. Recommend immediate deviation south." I say again, south. "Avoid area west of your position." 11 minutes. 11 minutes is nothing. 11 minutes is barely enough time for a report like that to reach a controller's desk, let alone reach every airplane already inside the cloud it described. We were not avoiding the ash. We had already been inside it for at least that long, and neither the panel nor our eyes had told us so until now. "Copy, deviating south," I said, and rolled us into the turn before I'd finished the sentence. It didn't matter. 4 minutes later, engine 2 right inboard gave a shudder that ran through the whole airframe. A stutter you could feel in your teeth before you saw it on the gauge. Then engine 1, on the same side, echoed it a half-second later, like a cough spreading through a room. "Compressor stalls, 1 and 2, Reyes said, calling it out twice, the way she always did. "Compressor stalls, 1 and 2. I throttled back on both. Watched the EGT needles climb and twitch and climb again. that particular graph line that every pilot learns to hate an engine trying to breathe through a lung full of glass. Because that's what volcanic ash is, when an engine swallows it. Not smoke, not soot. Microscopic shards of silica, melting inside the turbine, coating the blades in a glass so fine it looks like nothing at all until the engine simply stops agreeing to run. Anchorage Center. Reach 4-1. Declaring an emergency. Ash ingestion. Engines 1 and 2. Request lowest available altitude and vectors clear of the plume. Reach 4-1. Copy emergency. Descend and maintain 1 to 2000. Turn right heading 180. We descended. The shuddering eased, but it didn't stop. And somewhere in the back of the airplane a stack of supply crates shifted hard enough that I heard Iverson swear, low and controlled, the particular swear of someone bracing a patient with her own body instead of a strap. Reach 4-1. How copy, the controller said. And I realized I'd stopped answering, too focused on the film spreading across the wing to key the mic. Copy all, I said. Be advised our left wing is showing visible ash accumulation. This is not a light encounter. Copy. Reach 4-1. Recommend you expedite your descent and turn. We were already doing both, and it still wasn't fast enough, because the thing about an ash cloud at night, at altitude, with no weather radar built to distinguish it from ordinary cloud, is that you don't fly around it. You fly into the middle of it and only find out afterward how big it was. I want to tell you that this was the scary part. It wasn't. This was the part where the airplane still, more or less, worked. This was the part with a checklist. The scary part came 90 seconds later, when I called for an airspeed cross-check, and Reyes read me a number that didn't match mine by 40 knots, and then, before either of us could argue about which instrument to trust, both numbers, hers and mine, simply stopped moving at all. But before I take you there, I need you to sit, for a moment, in the 30 seconds of quiet that came right before it. Because that's the part nobody puts in these stories, and it's the part I remember most clearly. In that 30 seconds, with two engines struggling and an ash cloud we couldn't see swallowing the airplane whole, Iverson leaned over Corporal Ibarra, pulled the blanket up over his shoulder where it had slipped, and said something to him too quiet for me to hear. He wasn't conscious enough to understand it. She said it anyway. Then she reached up, without looking toward the cockpit, without any urgency in her hands at all, and tightened the strap across his chest one notch further. She did not know, in that moment, whether we would still be flying in 5 minutes. She fixed a blanket anyway. I've thought about that more than almost anything else that happened that night. Okafor moved through the cargo bay in that same 30 seconds, checking each restraint by hand, patient by patient, calling out a soft clear after every one, the way he would on any ordinary flight, no urgency added to his voice, none subtracted either. One of the other patients, a young airman with a leg wrapped to the knee, more scared than hurt, grabbed his sleeve and asked, straight out, if they were going to die. I heard Okafor's answer over the intercom, because he hadn't realized his own mic was keyed. Not on my watch, he said. You're strapped in tight. This crew up front is the best I've flown with, and if it comes down to it, I'll carry you off this airplane myself. Now breathe with me. In for 4. I don't know if the airman believed him. I know that I did, a little, hearing it, and I had a cockpit full of dying instruments to worry about instead of a leg wound, which tells you something about how much a calm voice is worth when nothing else in the world is offering you any certainty at all. 30 seconds later, the wall of numbers came. Here is what it means. Precisely. For a large aircraft to lose its pitot static system, the tubes and ports, no bigger than a pencil, that measure the pressure of the air rushing past the fuselage and turn it into the numbers a pilot lives by. Airspeed, altitude, vertical speed. Ash, drawn in by the same airflow that feeds the engines, does not stop at the engines. It finds every opening. It found ours. The airspeed indicator froze at 190 knots and stayed there no matter what the airplane actually did. The altimeter, a few seconds later, simply stopped climbing or falling, locked on a number that had nothing to do with our position over the water. The vertical speed indicator went to 0 and refused to move again. We were, for all practical purposes, flying blind. Not blind like fog. Fog you can descend through. Fog has a floor. Blind like a man with his eyes taped shut, walking forward on the memory of a hallway that might have changed shape since he last saw it. Standby instruments, Reyes said, calling it twice, her voice climbing half an octave on the second pass. Standby's reading the same, Captain, They're all frozen. I did the math out loud. Because saying it out loud is the only way to keep your own mind from sliding sideways in a moment like that. We have roughly 19 minutes of fuel remaining across 2 engines, I said. We are approximately 110 nautical miles from the nearest field with a runway rated for this airframe. At our last known ground speed, that's a flight time of roughly 26 minutes. We do not have 26 minutes. Reyes didn't say anything. Behind us, I heard Ibarra whistle 4 notes. Stop. Whistle them again. Anchorage Center, reach 4-1. We have lost pitot static instrumentation. Engines 1 and 2 remain degraded, requesting nearest suitable divert. The controller came back fast this time. Faster than before, and I understood from the speed of it that our situation had just been reclassified in whatever system controllers keep in their heads for how bad a given emergency is. Reach 4-1. Nearest field is Cordova, 62 miles. However, be advised runway length is insufficient for your aircraft category under current conditions. Nearest suitable runway is Anchorage International, 108 miles. There it was. The exact math I'd already done, confirmed, and made worse by a controller's flat, professional voice. 108 miles. 19 minutes of fuel. 2 engines that might not last that long, even if the fuel did. And 0 reliable information about how fast we were going, how high we were, or how quickly we were losing either. I want to be honest about what happened in my head in the next 10 seconds, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters. It was not fear, exactly. Fear is what Reyes had, I could hear it. A fast, shallow thing running under every word she said. What I had was closer to a kind of falling away. Every procedure I had built my whole career on, every redundancy, every checklist, all of it assumed instruments that worked. None of it told me what to do when the instruments simply stopped talking. And in that falling away unbidden, my hand went to my left breast pocket. I don't remember deciding to do it. I remember feeling the weight of the compass through the fabric, the way I'd felt it 1,000 times without ever taking it out. And for the first time in 6 years, I thought not in words, more like a pressure behind my sternum times he flew like this. Every day, with less than I have right now. I did not take it out. Not yet. We ran the standard divert options one more time, out loud, because I needed to hear them fail before I'd let myself believe they had. Cordova runway too short for our category, confirmed twice. A stretch of coastal highway Reyes found on the chart, flagged years ago as an emergency strip for exactly this kind of situation closed for winter maintenance. Snowbanks pushed to both shoulders, useless to us. A military strip 40 miles further north beyond our fuel. Beyond even the most generous version of our fuel. One by one, every answer the manual offered us turned out to be a door already closed, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very clear. The specific clarity that arrives only once every other option has been removed from the table. Anchorage Center, is there anyone in this airspace who can give us a visual reference? I said, because it was the only idea I had left that wasn't in a manual. Any aircraft, any station, anyone who can see us or knows this terrain. There was a pause. Then a new voice cut in, not the controllers. Unfiltered, closer, on a frequency we hadn't been using. Reach 4-1. This is a Cessna out of Chitina. I'm hearing your traffic on guard. I know this stretch of coast better than anybody flying it professionally ever will. You want a visual reference, I can be one. Civilian aircraft do not, as a rule, insert themselves into military emergencies over open water. Controllers do not, as a rule, allow it. But there is a point in every emergency past which the rulebook runs out of pages, and we were past it. Say your position, I said. 12 miles south of you, 7,000 feet, clear of the ash on my side. There's a lake long, frozen this time of year, wide enough and straight enough for what you're flying if you come in slow, and if you trust exactly what I tell you and nothing else. It's the only flat thing for 60 miles that isn't water. And if we don't trust you? Then you ditch in the Gulf with 10 people aboard and a sea state that won't let half of them out of the airplane. Your call, Captain. I'm not going anywhere either way. Reyes turned to me, eyes wide, and mouthed a single word, times who times, and I shook my head, because I didn't know either. Not yet. And there wasn't time to wonder. How do we know you're not just a guy with a radio and a guess? I said, because someone had to ask it, and it was my job to be the one. You don't, Doyle said. But I've put airplanes down on worse ice than that lake, with less fuel in my tank than you've got left, and every one of those airplanes is still flying today. You want a resume? I don't have time to read you one. You want a lake? I've got exactly one to offer you, and it's getting further behind us every second you spend asking. I looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at me. Behind us, Iverson had gone still, listening, one hand still resting flat on Corporal Ibarra's chest. Behind me, I heard Okafor's voice on the intercom, quiet, not meant for the cockpit but audible anyway through the thin bulkhead. Whatever you decide up there, Captain, we're with you. Every one of us back here. It wasn't a vote. Nobody was asking me to hold one. But it landed the way a hand on the shoulder lands, and I found myself sitting a little straighter in the seat because of it. Copy, I said. We're yours. Then stop calling me the Cessna, the voice said. And for just a second there was something almost like humor in it, dry and worn in, the specific humor of a man who has talked frightened pilots down before, and knows exactly how much of it to spend. Name's Frank Doyle. Give me your fuel state and your airframe and let's get to work. I gave him both. He didn't waste a second on sympathy. All right, reach 4-1. Your standby altimeter's frozen, but your GPS altitude readout should still be feeding off satellites, not off the pedo system. Check your FMS page, bottom left. Reyes found it in 4 seconds. A number. A real, moving number, not a static lie. We have GPS altitude, she said. 21,200, descending. Good. That's your altimeter now. Forget the round dial exists. For airspeed, you're going to fly attitude and power. I know your type's numbers. I've sat behind men who flew this exact model. Give me 8 degrees nose down, 62%, on what engines you've got left, and hold it there, no matter what the frozen gauge tells you. That'll get you close enough to safe that the ground will forgive the rest. Copy. 8 degrees, 62%, Reyes said, twice. And I heard something in her voice steady out for the first time since the numbers had frozen. Fuel, Doyle said a minute later. Give it to me again, exact. 16 minutes, maybe 17, split across 2 degraded engines. That's tighter than I'd like. What's your soul count? The question landed strange, and I must have hesitated, because he clarified before I could ask. Souls on board. How many people am I flying, Captain? Not how many seats. 10. 4 crew, 6 patients. 2 of the patients can't move on their own. There was a pause short, but I heard it. The particular silence of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. All right. Then we don't have room to be wrong twice. I need you to trust the numbers I give you the way you'd trust your own hands. Not because you know me, because right now, I'm the only set of eyes on this whole airspace that can actually see. Copy, I said. And something about the word times souls times stayed lodged in my chest the rest of the flight, the way certain words do when they arrive at exactly the wrong moment to be examined and exactly the right moment to be remembered. We flew like that GPS altitude standing in for a lie of an altimeter, attitude and memorized power settings, standing in for an airspeed indicator that no longer meant anything, a stranger's voice standing in for 60 years of aviation redundancy that had, all at once, gone quiet for 11 minutes. 11 minutes is nothing. I told you that already. 11 minutes, that morning, was also the longest stretch of time I have ever lived through. 2 minutes to the lake, Doyle said. Right on schedule. And I felt my stomach drop the way it does at the top of a hill you can't yet see the bottom of. That's when Engine 3, our last one, degraded like the others but still. Until that moment, spinning coughed once, twice, and went silent. There is a specific kind of silence that happens in a cockpit when the last engine dies. It isn't quiet. Exactly, the wind is still screaming past the fuselage. The electrical systems still hum. Somebody is always still talking. But something underneath all of it goes still, the way a house goes still when the furnace shuts off in winter, and you notice, all at once, exactly how cold it already was. Compressor stall, Engine 3, Reyes said, and this time she didn't call it twice. This time, all she said, after the silence stretched half a second too long, was, very quietly, "We're not going to make it." I want to tell you I had some perfect, cinematic answer for that. I didn't. What I had was the compass, finally out of my pocket, in my left hand. Not because it was navigating anything, it wasn't. It couldn't, not in an airplane like this, but because my hand needed to be holding something that had belonged to a man who had done exactly this, without any of what I had, and lived. For one long second, my hand closed around the compass and did not move, and every year of training I had built my identity on top of went strangely silent, and underneath that silence was something older, something that had been waiting patiently in my chest since I was 19 years old for exactly this moment to arrive. I thought of my father's hands on a control yoke half the size of the one in front of me now. I thought of the word he used to say every single time weather turned bad and a client in the back seat asked if we were going to be all right. We fly the airplane we have, not the one we wish we had. I had hated that saying for 6 years. In that second, gliding on dead engines toward a lake I still couldn't see, I understood it for the first time. We are, I said. Doyle, talk to me. 60 seconds, he said, and something in his voice had changed too, not less calm, but closer. Like he'd stopped being a voice on a radio and started being a person standing directly behind my shoulder. Look for the tree line. When you see the tree line, you're mine. Gliding a fully loaded transport aircraft with 0 working engines is not, technically, impossible. It is, however, an event so rare that most pilots who train for it never expect to use it. You trade altitude for distance at a ratio your airframe was never designed to advertise. And you do it with a control feel that goes heavier and stranger, the longer the engines stay dead, because every hydraulic system on a modern aircraft assumes those engines are running to power it. Reyes, backup hydraulics. Now, I said, and she had it done before I finished the sentence. One useful thing about a co-pilot who repeats everything twice is that her hands move as fast as her mouth. The ash cleared, all at once, the way weather sometimes does not gradually, just a curtain pulled back and there below us, through a windshield gone, the color of old glass, was white. Not sky white, ground white. A long pale ribbon between black tree lines, exactly where Doyle had promised it would be. I have the lake, I said. Good. Now listen close because I'm only going to say this once and you won't have time to ask me to repeat it. You're high. You're going to feel high. Ignore that feeling, trust me. Not your gut. Nose down another 2 degrees. Aim, mot the near third. The ice thickens as it goes north. The near end's been open water 3 weeks out of the last 4. Copy, far third. When you're 100 feet up, you're going to want to flare early. Don't. Hold your attitude until I tell you. This airframe doesn't forgive an early flare with no power behind it. How do you know what this airframe forgives? I said, half a question, half something closer to disbelief, because everything about the way he spoke suggested a man who'd never sat behind the controls of anything this size in his life. I don't, not personally, Doyle admitted, but I know gliding, and gliding doesn't care how big the airplane is, only how much it weighs and how fast it's willing to slow down before it stops flying altogether. Physics doesn't read tail numbers, Captain. It just does what it does. Your job's to give it exactly the numbers it needs, and my job's to tell you what those numbers are, because right now I'm the only one who can see the ground you're aiming at. And if you're wrong, then we're both wrong together, and neither one of us has to live with having done nothing. A pause, and then, quieter. I'd rather be wrong trying than be right doing nothing. I've made my peace with which one keeps you up at night less. Behind me, I heard Iverson's voice, low, steady, not to me, to the patients. We're coming down soft, she said, to 6 people who mostly couldn't hear her and one, Ibarra, who whistled his 4 notes right on top of her sentence like an answer. We're coming down soft. Hold on to each other. The ground came up faster than any simulator had ever taught me to expect. Because a simulator can teach you the numbers, but it cannot teach you the specific, private terror of watching a frozen lake fill your entire windshield, with no engine sound behind you to argue against gravity. Reyes was calling out the GPS altitude in a steady stream now, no longer twice each, once, clean, fast, a metronome instead of a habit. 300, 250, 200, coming down clean. You're doing beautifully, Doyle said, and I don't know why that word, out of everything he could have chosen, was the one that nearly broke me. Not times good, not times fine, beautifully. Like he was watching something he recognized, something he'd watched once before, a long time ago, and was grateful to be watching again. 150 feet, Reyes called. 50 feet, Doyle said. Hold it, hold it. 20 feet, Reyes said, and her voice cracked clean in half on the second word. 20 feet, Doyle said. 15. Steady, steady, don't you dare flinch on me now, Compass. I'm not flinching. I know. I can hear it in your voice. 10 feet. Hold. Now, Doyle said. Flare now. I pulled. the nose came up. For one full second, the airplane hung there, exactly the way physics says a 38-ton glider should not be able to hang, suspended between falling and flying, and then the belly of the aircraft met the ice, with a sound I will never be able to describe to anyone who hasn't heard it. Not a crash, not exactly, something closer to a scream made of metal and impact and ice fracturing in every direction at once. We slid. God, we slid. 300 yards, maybe more. The airframe shuddered, screamed, slewed sideways. The ice beneath us cracked in long white lines, racing out ahead of our own weight, faster than we were moving, like the lake itself was trying to warn the water underneath that something was coming. Metal tore somewhere beneath the flight deck, a long, grinding shriek that didn't stop, that seemed to go on and on past any length a sound should reasonably last. Something in the cargo bay broke loose and slammed into the aft bulkhead hard enough that I felt it through the rudder pedals. Reyes screamed a word that wasn't a word. I didn't blame her. Part of me was screaming it too, silently, behind teeth clenched so hard my jaw would ache for 2 days afterward. Brace! I shouted, uselessly, because there was nothing left to brace with no thrust to control, no rudder that mattered at this speed, just physics and ice, and 10 people's lives sliding toward whatever the far end of that lake had waiting. We stopped 11 feet from open water. I know it was 11 feet because I counted them. Afterward, walking it myself in the freezing dark, needing to know exactly how much margin a stranger's voice and a dead man's instincts had bought us. 11 feet of ice, cracked in a spider web radiating out from beneath our left wing, holding just barely, just exactly enough against 38 tons of airplane that had, 40 seconds earlier, still been falling out of the sky. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that cockpit said a word. Then Corporal Ibarra, from somewhere in the back, still half sedated, still not entirely present in the world the rest of us had just fought our way back into, whistled his 4 notes one more time. And Iverson, I found out later, laughed. One short, cracked, disbelieving laugh and pressed her forehead against his shoulder for exactly as long as it took her to remember there were 9 other people who needed her hands. Getting 10 people off a wrecked, slowly cracking aircraft in the middle of a frozen lake, in the dark, in temperatures that had already dropped past what any of the wounded could survive for long, is its own story, one made of ladders improvised from cargo straps, of carrying Ibarra's litter across ice that groaned under every step, of Reyes standing in the open cargo door, directing each transfer with a flashlight in one hand, and her other hand shaking so hard, she finally just sat down on the ramp between patients and let her body do what it needed to do once the job was finished. It took 40 minutes for the first snowmobiles to reach us. 3 of them, headlights bouncing across the ice, driven by men and women from a village I won't name here because they didn't ask to be part of anyone's story, only to be neighbors to whoever needed them. They wrapped every one of us, wounded and crew alike, in blankets that smelled like wood smoke and diesel, and somebody put a thermos of something hot into my hands that I don't remember drinking, but must have, because it was empty an hour later when I finally sat still long enough to notice. Okafor, still moving on the adrenaline that hadn't yet let go of him, worked the transfers alongside the villagers, without stopping to speak, until the last patient was off the ice, and only then did he sit down hard on an overturned supply crate and put his head in both hands, and I understood, watching him, that some part of every one of us would need a long time to fully come back down from that ice, longer than the 40 minutes it took the rescue to arrive. Reyes found me somewhere in the middle of it, both of us still in our flight suits, both of us still shaking in the particular way you shake after your body has spent its entire supply of calm and has nothing left to spend. She didn't say anything about the flight. She just stood next to me for a while, close enough that our shoulders touched, watching the last of the patients get loaded onto a sled. And eventually she said, very quietly, I called it. I said we weren't going to make it. I know, I said. I was wrong. I know that too. She almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive. Doesn't feel like being wrong yet, she said. Feels like something else. I don't have a word for it. You will, I told her. Give it a few days. Frank Doyle landed his Cessna on a cleared stretch of the same lake, 20 minutes after the snowmobiles arrived. I watched him climb down out of the cockpit, an older man, maybe 70, moving like his knees had opinions about the cold but his hands didn't, the hands of someone who had spent 50 years doing exactly what his hands were told. He walked across the ice toward me without hurrying, the way you walk toward something you've been walking toward for a long time. Captain Marsh, he said, when he was close enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. Not compass. My name, my actual last name, which I had never given him, neither had the controllers, not on any frequency he'd have had access to. Only my first name and call sign had gone out over that radio. "How do you know my name?" I said. It wasn't really a question. My hand had already gone back to my breast pocket, to the compass, before I'd finished asking it. Doyle looked at the compass in my hand, just glanced at it, once, the way you glance at something you already know the shape of in the dark, because I flew search patterns for 6 weeks looking for a man named Dana Marsh, out of a strip near Chitina. "Back before you were old enough to remember what your father's voice sounded like on a radio," he said. "I flew with him for 11 years before that. Taught him half of what almost killed him, and all of what would have saved him, if the weather that day had given him one more minute to use it." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have broken something in me that I needed to keep whole a little while longer, standing on cracking ice with 9 other people's lives still technically in my hands. "You've got his hands on the controls," Doyle said. "I heard it the second you gave me your power settings back there, the way you held them steady instead of chasing the gauges. That's not something the Air Force teaches. That's something you either grew up watching or you didn't." He looked at the compass again. "Looks like you grew up watching." "He'd have been proud," Doyle added, after a moment, almost as an afterthought, though I don't believe for a second it was one. "Not of the landing. Landings are luck and physics in equal measure, and you had both tonight. Proud that you still had it in you to trust a voice on a radio when every gauge on your panel had already told you not to trust anything. That's the part that isn't luck. That's the part he'd have recognized." He didn't say anything else about my father. Not his name again, not the crash, not the 6 weeks of searching that had ended the way it ended. Just those 2 lines, standing alone, saying everything he wasn't going to explain further. Then he turned, walked back toward his airplane, and left me standing there with a compass in my bare hand, ice cracking somewhere behind me under the weight of an aircraft that would never fly again. 10 people alive, who by every reasonable measure should not have been. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of a different C-17, a replacement airframe, on a runway in Anchorage under a sky so clear it looked freshly washed. Reyes was already in the right seat, running the pre-flight checklist twice. Out of habit now, not nerves, I'd noticed the difference. Iverson was somewhere in the back with a new set of patients, checking straps that didn't need checking, the way she always would. I climbed into the left seat, ran my hand along the edge of the instrument panel, every gauge exactly where it belonged, every backup system present and accounted for, every piece of redundancy I had built my career around. Still there, still trustworthy, still not the whole story anymore. I took the compass out of my pocket. I didn't look at it for long. I found a strip of adhesive tape in the side pocket where pilots keep things they're not supposed to need, and I mounted it small, brass, unnecessary by every modern standard on the edge of the panel, just below the primary flight display, where I would see it every single time I looked at the instruments that mattered. I didn't say anything about it to Reyes. She noticed anyway. I saw her eyes flick to it, then to me, then back to her checklist, and she didn't ask, and I was grateful for that more than I could have explained to her. I never called the frequency Frank Doyle used that night again. I wrote his number down on a scrap of paper the next morning, in the terminal, hands still not quite steady, and I've carried that scrap in the same pocket the compass used to live in ever since. I haven't used it. I don't know if I ever will. Some things, I've come to understand, aren't meant to be used, only kept. The way you keep a compass you don't strictly need, in case the day comes when everything else you were told to trust goes quiet all at once. I did go back, once, before that first flight. I drove out to the strip near Chitina where my father used to keep his plane, a place I hadn't seen since I was 19, and I stood at the edge of the gravel runway for a long time without going any closer. There's nothing dramatic to report about it. No revelation, no tears I hadn't already cried years earlier, alone, in places nobody saw. Just a woman standing at the edge of a small runway in the cold, understanding, finally, that the thing she'd spent 6 years running from, and the thing that had just saved 10 lives over a frozen lake were the same thing, wearing 2 different names. Corporal Ibarra recovered. I heard, secondhand, months later, that when he was finally lucid enough to be asked about the whistling, he didn't recognize the 4 notes at all, didn't know the song, couldn't place where his own body had learned it. Iverson still has the recordings. She says she's not sure why she's kept them, except that some things, once you've paid that much attention to them, you don't feel right letting go of. Reyes made captain 18 months later, ahead of schedule, on the strength of a fitness report that used the word times composed times 4 separate times, which still makes both of us laugh, because we both know exactly which 20 minutes over the Gulf of Alaska that word is quietly describing. I keyed the mic, ran my checklist, and pushed the throttles forward. The compass didn't move. It never does. That was never the point of carrying it.